Welcome back to Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that is our honor to put together for you every week from the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. VirginiaInstitute.org is our website, and of course our YouTube channel is where you find the archive footage, if you will. It's just a logo of the group and then the audio that you're listening to. But if you want to go back and find previous interviews, that's where they are. Our next guest from the Edmund Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies at the Heritage Foundation, legal fellow there, Zack Smith, is on with us. Zack, welcome back to Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me on today. I really appreciate it.
And you've been covering and kind of tracking the tearing apart of our society, and I often wonder whether the fall of Rome or the French Revolution, if talk radio had existed then, this would sort of be the way it was going, because it just seems like there's I don't know if it's the poverty that leads to the willing co-conspirators. The pawns in this game are obviously coming from impoverished communities where let's call them the Robespierres are out there saying, well, you don't have money because these rich SOBs have money, and go after it. And as soon as they said defund, dismantle the police, I said, well, that's who protects private property rights. And now, I guess over the weekend, Portland, bless their heart for figuring nobody was going to question them. A young lady in a Black Lives Matter protest started hollering at homeowners, get out of your homes, give us your homes.
Right.
I can't believe how right I was when I first started hearing dismantle the police. What are you guys seeing there? And is it anything we can get a grasp on that we could ride this out or fix?
Well, we're seeing troubling scenes coming out places like Portland and Seattle, and even in other cities, Los Angeles, Chicago, New York to some extent.
Richmond.
And Richmond as well, absolutely, D.C. And unfortunately, what we're seeing really is a degradation of law and order. We're seeing an unwillingness by elected officials to allow state and local police officers to go in and do their jobs, essentially to maintain law and order and to enforce the laws as written against all lawbreakers, regardless of what causes they support, regardless of their race, religion, ethnicity, any of those types of characteristics. And especially in Portland, we've just seen a complete abdication of the responsibilities that elected officials have. Not only are they not allowing state and local police officers to do their jobs, they're affirmatively taking actions that will make it much, much more difficult for them, for police officers, and make their jobs more dangerous as well. And so it's troubling in a lot of ways. And unfortunately, unless we get a grip on this situation now, it could get a lot worse before we start, seeing it get better.
Well, and is it a fair point to say all of these politicians, these mayors and these governors that are saying, oh, boy, look at these crazy kids on the street, are the ones who actually wrote the laws that the police officers are enforcing? Now, I'm not saying the guy in Minneapolis was right for kneeling on the guy's neck, but now, details are coming out about the training that shows exactly why law enforcement officers are shown in a violent situation that's the best way to diffuse a society if at a time if somebody's kind of having a violent incident. But that being said, at some point you have to be sensitive to say this guy's in dire straits. We've got to stop. But that being said, in so many of these cases, the quote out of control police are just enforcing laws that these politicians wrote.
Well, look, George Floyd was murdered. There's based on what we know now, there's pretty clear evidence that that's the case. And George Floyd's, death is a sad and tragic event, as it is really any time someone's killed, or any time police officers have to use self-defense and, a death ensues. But look, police officers have a very difficult job. They're on the front lines day in, day out, often asked to make split-second decisions in very tense, very difficult situations. And even though, we do see tragic incidents like George Floyd's death, the majority of police officers are good, hardworking individuals who, frankly, do jobs that the rest of us would find very difficult to do.
Oh, yeah.
And so what we're seeing in places like Portland, Seattle, is that when the police officers are not allowed to do their jobs, to do their duty, enforce the laws, engage with the community, we're seeing not only a rise in violent crime, but really anarchy in places where police officers are not allowed to go in.
Mm-hmm.
And so, several weeks ago, we heard from Seattle's police chief, who has since resigned because the cuts proposed by the Seattle City Council were so drastic. But she said, look, in CHOP, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, there were rapes, there were robberies, other violent acts that the police officers weren't able to get to protect individuals and to investigate appropriately because city officials would not give them the sign-off to go in and retake control of that area.
Oh, yeah, there are dead young men because of it, and sadly, almost predictably. Now, you write about trying to come up with a way to end this outside of finding courageous politicians who can stand up for the laws they write. I don't know how we end this, because that's really where I think it starts, is somebody says, well, why was my nephew arrested in the first place? Or you start hearing about drug crimes or victimless crimes, quote unquote. But if we as a society have determined something is against the law, the person who legislated that should stand up for it, not turn around and say, I don't know why the police arrested your nephew.
Well, look, and we do hear the term victimless crimes a lot. But the fact is, a lot of crimes that, many people consider to be victimless, drugs, prostitution, other quality of life offenses, in fact, are often some of the most detrimental that we face as a society. And the collateral consequences of those crimes are very significant to the communities they affect. And so it's important that we enforce all the laws on the books as written, and it ties into kind of another problem we're seeing as well. Recently, George Soros, the New York billionaire, has made a massive push to elect so-called progressive prosecutors across the country.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not progressive really in any sense of the term. They're just rogue district attorneys who are refusing to enforce the laws as written. And so the problem we're seeing now in places like San Francisco, Philadelphia, areas of New York, is that these George Soros elected prosecutors are in office, and even if the police officers are arresting individuals, making good arrests, doing their duty, prosecutors are just dismissing the charges. They're saying, look, there are whole categories of crimes we're just not going to prosecute. And really, that's an abdication of their duty, and in many ways is one of the most dangerous threats we currently face to the rule of law. Because if elected prosecutors, are not going to do their jobs and prosecute crimes, then it undermines the whole basis of our society, that we're built on a foundation of the rule of law.
Well, we saw it in Chicago where that one rioter looter was caught on camera saying, well, I don't care, this is reparations. This is what has happened, is these politicians have played the race card too long, I think, anyway. Zack Smith is on from the Meese Center at the Heritage Foundation and have created this idea that somehow if somebody has money, it's because they've kept it from you. And this seems to be the effect of that.
Right. And it's certainly a dangerous dynamic we're seeing play out in a lot of places. But in terms of immediate steps for what, we can do as a society to try to push back against this current, to retake control of the cities and neighborhoods that are kind of being lost to this anarchy, first of all, we have to elect good officials. There's just no way around it. It's up to state, local leaders, elected DAs to enforce the laws as written. Mm-hmm. And so that's a big push, a big focus. We have to get good folks in office. There is a role for the federal government to play here as well. The federal government's not really equipped, and by design isn't meant to enforce a lot of the street level crimes that we're talking about. But what the federal government can do, and what the federal government is really good at, is focusing their targeted resources on broad conspiracies, and high-level officials. And so if there are certain high-level individuals that are organizing these violent protests, that are providing funding in inappropriate ways to facilitate this violence, that would certainly be a good use of federal resources to kind of target those individuals and go after it and kind of cut the head off of the beast and hopefully make a dent and push back against these violent actions in that way.
Zach, we saw the video, obviously, of the couple in St. Louis who, by their, contributions were lifelong Democrats, even gave money to Black Lives Matter, and all of a sudden the rioters were on their front lawn and they had firearms in their hands. It reminded me how close and how amazing it's been now, 6 months into these riots, that we haven't had somebody defending their private property that winds up grievously or even just a little bit injuring somebody in the defense of their property. It's a nightmare scenario as to what's going to happen if that does happen.
Right. And unfortunately, one of the collateral consequences I think we'll see coming out of this, out of the fact that police officers are not being allowed to do their duty to enforce the laws and intervene in a lot of these, potentially violent situations, is we will see more people, exercising their right of self-defense. And so, over the weekend, there was the video circulating on social media of the individual who's pulled out of his car.
The truck driver,
being pretty severely by protesters. And so unfortunately, what situations, like that will probably start to escalate to, from now on, instead of stopping if protesters are blocking the roadway or surrounding someone's car, it's likely we may see more people either kind of, ramming through the protesters with their vehicles, or if they're armed, have a concealed carry permit, potentially using deadly force if they feel threatened. And so it's just there are a lot of collateral consequences that are going to stem from this complete abdication by state and local officials and their failure to do their duty and allow police officers to enforce the law and protect, people and property in their communities.
What happened to the word peaceably? We hear a lot of these folks who, throw the First Amendment around, and I'm talking about the elected officials saying, oh, it's their First Amendment rights. I distinctly remember the word peaceably being part of the First Amendment, Zach, and I bring this up intentionally, but your thought on that?
Yeah, look, we absolutely have a right to peaceably assemble, to peaceably protest. That's a core First Amendment right, one that, all of us hold very dear and would fight very aggressively to protect.
Yeah.
But if what a lot of we're seeing in Portland, Seattle, around the country, if these are peaceful protests, then I have a very different definition of peaceful protest.
Well,
what we're seeing is anarchy.
Yeah.
It's anarchy, really, in a lot of ways. And anytime there's violence, destruction of property, threats to individuals, that has to stop. And state officials, local officials need to take action. And I think where they haven't, the federal government, to the extent they can, especially in protecting federal property, federal courthouses, and the like, have taken very appropriate actions to do their duty and protect those facilities.
Well, what about this and your organization and your division of the Heritage Foundation, named after an attorney general? The attorney general Barr, it was very clear. He said, "Well, these are protests that are taken over by small groups of these anarchists." I remember in the early days of the Tea Party, we were very afraid of the Lyndon LaRouche Society showing up with their Obama is Hitler posters and making the Tea Party movement look nutty by their behavior. And we were trying to be self-policing. Is it even possible to expect a group of folks who might really be upset over something that happened in their community and is just marching about, call it housing equity, but then the mob gets taken over by 4 or 5 infiltrators with Molotov cocktails? Is it unfair to ask them to try to self-police a little bit?
Well, look, I certainly think groups should try to self-police. We've seen talk of some community organizers trying to self-police their events But really, the responsibility for this falls on those elected officials, because once the violence starts, police officers, and if need be, backup from other jurisdictions need to go into those communities, go into those neighborhoods, and restore order. Because when there's order, when there's the safety of all individuals peacefully protesting is ensured, that's when people are really free to voice their views. And that's just not what we're seeing now. We're seeing intimidation, threats. If you voice a different view from a lot of these violent thugs on the street, you're facing intimidation, potentially being beaten. And that is not, covered by the First Amendment, those violent actions. Mm-hmm. And so our elected officials really have to get control of this situation. And it's really when safety and order are restored that we can fully enjoy our First Amendment rights.
Yeah. Well, and societally, I mean, just as an armchair sociologist, Zach, I'll be the first to tell you, August 12th, 2017, here in Charlottesville, I was covering the riots. And a young man bumped into me, all caught up in the reverie of it, started yelling that I was a racist. We were about to fight. There was an intercession. Everything stopped, and they went on their way. And I ran into the kid later after the whole mob scene had died down. He was the sweetest, he was a student at Columbia University in New York, but he had gotten caught up in this mob rule, and he was a crazed person. This is why unlawful assembly laws are in the books, because these mobs, are full of people who individually are probably not nearly like they are as a mob.
Well, and look, I think government officials should be and have been in many cases very accommodating to groups that really do want to peacefully protest. They've been very accommodating in terms of, the space where they're allowed to protest, not imposing particularly onerous time, place, manner restrictions on them. But the troubling thing is, we've seen across the country the violence start coming out in a lot of these rallies and protests. And again, when the violence starts, that's really when law enforcement has to move in and, protect people and property in those areas.
So what is your feeling? Zack Smith is on with us from the Meesh Center for Legal and Judicial Studies at the Heritage Foundation, heritage.org. Zack, what is your feeling, and what is the feeling at the Meesh Center? How much worse does this get before it gets better, or is there a flashpoint, or is this a civil war? What is the feeling there?
Well, I can only speak for myself, but, I think if we as a society make clear to our elected officials that what's happening currently is unacceptable, and they'll be voted out of office if they don't take appropriate action soon, that will probably be the quickest path to change. In the meantime, it's important to remember, if people really are peacefully protesting, great. I fully encourage it. Even if I strongly disagree with what you're saying or what you're protesting about, that's what makes one of the things that makes us great as a society. Our ability to disagree vigorously, loudly with each other on important topics. But again, when the violence stops, we have to be very quick to say this is unacceptable and support leaders who are willing to take appropriate action to restore law and order in our communities.
I know that much has been made, and it's fascinating to me, Zach, how the mostly Democratic Party-led cities and states where this is happening, have managed to somehow make this all about the president, who had very little, if anything, to do with any of the poverty and the issues with law enforcement in these cities and states. What do you think happens in November? And I'm not asking you to take a political stand, but I guess the implication is that if Joe Biden wins, this will all stop, and if Donald Trump wins, this is just the appetizer. I don't see how that happens, because I don't see how that changes anything with who's in the White House.
Well, look, we've seen a lot of pushback from local and state officials. The governor of Oregon said she wanted, quote, Trump's troops out of Portland. Yeah. Well, the fact is that those were federal law enforcement officers in Portland protecting federal property, the Portland Federal Courthouse, because the governor and the mayor of Portland, Ted Wheeler, would not allow their police officers to protect that federal property. And I think the president's actions in sending in federal officers to protect that federal property is not only appropriate, but it's really his duty to do that.
Sure.
And so I think to the extent that President Trump has taken strong, decisive action to protect federal property, to not allow protesters to essentially burn down a federal courthouse is appropriate. And I would hope that whoever wins in November, whether it be President Trump or Joe Biden, personal property, are injuring people, again, is not acceptable. But when the federal government has the resources and ability to protect federal property, they have to do it. And it's really an issue of ensuring not only the safety of the community, but in the instance of protecting the Portland Federal Courthouse, ensuring access to justice for millions of Oregon citizens.
Yeah, unbelievably so, right? I suppose. Last one for you, Zach, and it really goes to what I think leads to these policies and these abdications is the abdication of the vote. We see so frequently mayors and city councils elected with 50% of 45% voter turnout. So you're ostensibly encouraging politicians to pander to smaller and smaller segments of the population to get their elected office. Can this be inoculated a little bit by greater voter turnout of people who may stay home because they don't think, the House of Delegates isn't that important in Virginia, or my Board of Supervisors or my school board isn't that important, but maybe not just getting out to vote, but maybe even, heaven's sakes, get involved and maybe run for some of these positions?
Absolutely. Getting thrown out of office is probably the strongest incentive that elected officials have to take certain actions and to be responsive to their community members. And it's important to remember the vast majority of laws that we deal with in our day-to-day lives don't come from the federal government. Despite what we might hear on CNN or Fox News or MSNBC, it's laws passed by your local city council, passed by your state legislature. So those races are absolutely critical. And yes, folks listening to your show should absolutely get informed and be sure to vote in each election that they're eligible to vote in, because those races are critically important in so many ways.
Zach, as we finish up here, what are you guys working on at the Meese Center? What's coming next, or is it just going to be continued coverage at heritage.org? And I guess you can read a lot of the stuff at the Daily Signal as well. But
Right.
Continuing coverage of this, or are there other things afoot that you guys are working on at the Meese Center?
Well, we're certainly paying close attention to this, intend to continue to cover this. Just this morning, my colleague John Malcolm and I, we released a list of 14 names that we think would be great additions to the Supreme Court whenever President Trump, if President Trump gets a chance to nominate another justice. We're also paying particularly close attention to this problem of the rogue prosecutors, seeing kind of what's going on around the country with that. And then also, in a lot of places, unfortunately, conservatives, Christians, other individuals are facing a lot of restrictions and hurdles in terms of being able to worship. The governor of Nevada has capped churches at a much lower level than he has at casinos in the state. And so those types of infringements on individuals' rights, threats to religious liberty, freedom of speech, those types of topics are all ones that, we all care very deeply about and are paying close attention to right now.
Well, certainly, and the prosecutors ones, or the what do they call it, survival crime prosecutors that Spurious George has put in there, I think is a big topic. We should have you back on that, Zach. Thank you and everyone there at the Heritage Foundation for your work.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
And thank you on behalf of the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. I'm Joe Thomas. Until next week, so long, and thanks for all the fish.